Hello, happy day, and thank you for joining us, you animals. We know you basically have the option to listen to anything in the world, and we really appreciate you listening to us. If you are interested in seeing Cecil's artwork, you can find him on Instagram at the artwork of Cecil Porter. Facebook is Cecil Porter Illustration. YouTube channel is Cecil Porter. And you can visit www.cecilporterstudios.com to support the artwork and this podcast by purchasing prints and original artwork. As a reminder, if you do enjoy this content, please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe to this channel. And without further delay, let's pick up with the conversation. Okay, so last week was kind of crazy and a little disjointed when we recorded.
Yeah, I think we found out that we need some sort of outline because the episode that I think was the better one, we had a brief outline on, and then last week we winged it and it was just everywhere.
But last week we did go through, we started in on a topic about references.
Yep.
So I wanted to go back to that a little bit because we've had kind of this conversation about people thinking, like, does using reference make them a bad artist? So I'm not an artist, and I know that I've heard multiple times that, you know, someone's a real artist. They can create these worlds from their brain. They don't need reference. And I guess I never really thought much of it, but I'm just a guy. So you being an actual trained artist, can you, I mean, I get you can only talk for yourself, but can you make art well without reference materials?
No, I can't. I will start out with like a different style, and we'll talk about that in a little bit to get my basic idea down. But I do not have the mental library to create anything realistic looking, and especially with I'm doing these like fantastical creatures, right? They're just really crazy, and you have to sell them as real unless you're trying to do a more cartoony style or something like that. That's
Right.
cutesy. I'm not. I'm trying to create these weird anthropomorphic, weird, whatever creatures, and I want you to believe that there's a humanity to them, that there's something tangible to them, and I just don't believe you can create a realistic style with. I mean, how do you develop a mental library like that? Now, I've seen stuff that's rendered out, but I think there's a big difference between rendering something out and making something look realistic.
But you still say that people should draw as much as they can, right? Even without reference?
Yes, absolutely. I think you need to work that side of your brain out. And I think that the stronger you make that side of your brain and the more you build up that recall of information that you get from drawing from reference, I think the better you get at relying less and less on reference.
Do people get to a point maybe when they draw without reference, though, that they start kind of practicing bad habits? Maybe you get too far away.
You can, and sometimes that can become somebody's style. You look at certain guys out there, and it's a really cool style, and you can tell they're barely using any reference, if any at all. And then you look at other guys that have a really cool style, and they're working strictly from reference. I think that's where you need to have a network of people who are better than you. Because if you get too out of whack and you're not attempting to do that on purpose, then they can kind of be like, hey, you know, let me rein you back in a little bit. You need to borrow people whose eyes are better than yours because you're only as good as your eyes, you know, and so you're only going to draw at that level. So if you are practicing a bad habit, then chances are you're not going to catch it, but somebody with better eyes than you will.
But if you're using reference anyway, I mean, should people bother studying like anatomy and planes and light and structure?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I try to tell it to people, because you get asked that a lot, I don't see why I need to even study anatomy or do life drawing if I'm, you know, just gonna work from photographs.
Because internet.
Yeah, because the thing with a photograph is you're taking a 3-dimensional image and compressing it to a 2-dimensional surface, so you're losing a lot of information. So we can all look at something. And let's use a face, for example. I can look at you right now and see where the shadow's casting over your orbital socket down to your, like, well, we'll just say cheekbones, because a lot of people don't understand it. They don't know the anatomy. And you get a shadow there, right? And everybody can look at that and they can draw that shadow. But one, if you don't know the anatomy that's causing that shadow, you may not design the shape well. You don't know the insertion points of the muscles that connect to it. You don't understand what direction that plane is facing for sure, because sometimes through different types of lights and artificial lights, your values can get a little muddied up, especially when you're looking at a photograph or even print quality or, screen, whatever. And so maybe you're looking at a plane and you misinterpret it as a side-facing plane when it should be a front-facing plane, right? So if you know the anatomy and you understand the planes and you know the forms and the structure that relates to that, then what happens is you can take the missing information from that reference and make it better. And when you get good enough at understanding that part of it, then you can start to design based off the knowledge you have. And that's where art really starts to take a step up, is when you're looking at that information and you understand the stuff behind that information so well that you can design it and make it become something that's can be far greater than anything that was ever in a photograph. And so you only get that if you study anatomy, do life drawing. Because the thing with life drawing is you're now interpreting everything you see from a 3-dimension. It's a living, breathing, moving model. They're getting up, they're getting down, they're moving positions slightly. So you really start to develop an eye that you can only get from drawing from life, because you're not working off a compressed image. If you have to work off a photograph, then you have to work off a photograph. But every town pretty much has some sort of life drawing. And I really, really think that if you want to see your skills as an artist progress, you have to draw from life. And you can't say, well, I want to do cartooning, so I don't feel like I need to draw from life. Well, why does Pixar make their guys do it? Why does Disney make their guys do it? Why does Nickelodeon make their guys do it? The reason is because you have to know the rules before you can bend the rules.
Right.
Ignorance, and I've said this a million times, ignorance is not an excuse for style. If you're calling what you do style, but it's wrong.
If you're only doing it because you don't know how to do it better, or you refuse to learn how to do it the correct way. Yeah,
exactly. And there's people out there who'll be like, it's art. It's not about being wrong. There's so many rules to good art.
Art is a subjective thing in totality, but there are objective issues within art that you can look at, of course. Right. So you want to have the basis, you want to have the knowledge, but, oh good, it started on a separate audio track. Okay, we're back. So we almost lost the entire project there for a second. We made it back in. So, but to go back to it, so you do have the knowledge, you do have that background, like we were talking about studying anatomy. But again, we go back to these references. And it seems like a real obvious thing to me that you would try to use as many references as humanly possible where they are available. So why do artists get so weird then when you start talking about using reference? Because it seems like people sort of start to clam up a little bit when you talk about using references in art.
I think there's a stigma behind it, and the stigma doesn't make any sense to me. But I used to fall into that until I got around great artists and seeing that they all use reference. I think to the general public, when you're talking to them and they find out that you use reference, all of a sudden you're less of an artist. I don't know why that exists, because in illustration, most of the greatest illustrators used reference, if not all of them. I mean, one of the greatest illustrators of all time, Norman Rockwell, was one of the guys who was super open about the fact that he used reference. He photographed his own models in his own poses and stuff like that.
Yeah, but didn't he get a lot of shit for that?
He did, especially from Leyendecker, because Leyendecker felt like if you were going to use reference, you should create your own as far as not photographs. He would bring his models into the studio, do tons and tons and tons and tons of studies of that model, dismiss the model, and then design his painting based off of his studies of the model. It's a great process, and you're going to be a tremendous artist if you master that. But especially in today's climate, there's no way you're going to get the allotted time you would need to do something like that on a piece. You know what I mean? It's just no way. It's
too time intensive.
Yeah. It's just way easier to hire a model, pose them, light them. If you have costuming, dress them, whatever. Take the photograph. You're going to get the ideal angle, the ideal representation of what you think you want. And then hopefully you can make it more than your reference. Now, there's a lot of guys who do tremendous paintings because they're super technical artists, but it doesn't really become more than the photograph they took. It just looks like the model really posed. And,
right.
And it's not, that's more of a subjective thing, I guess. But, it's just, I think a lot of people are afraid to look like bad artists. And a lot of people who aren't artists go, oh, you worked off a picture? Well, you're a bad artist then. Because they think that all these artists create stuff. But if you go back and you look at the guys that are considered the greatest of all time, you look at, Bouguereau and Sargent and Rockwell and Frazetta and all these guys that all worked from reference. And it's like, well, if these guys are considered the greats, then why am I less of an artist if I work from reference?
All right. So we're getting somewhere there. So great artists are going to, they will continue to use reference. So what's then, maybe there's a different way of thinking about reference. What's the right way of thinking about using references then?
Well, my phrase that I tell a lot of people when they want guidance on it from me is always make sure that your reference works for you. You don't work for your reference. If you're beholden to the reference and you're limited by what the reference provides you, then you don't have a strong enough foundation in art, I don't believe.
So give me an example of that. What do you mean?
Okay, if I photograph a model and I'm basically just painting a portrait of that model, then I'm a slave to the reference, right? Unless that's my intent. But if my intent is to photograph a model and make it, I don't know, a troll who's jumping in midair, you're not going to pose a model and photograph them in a static pose. It's going to look like it has movement. You have to be able to push that reference well beyond what it is. One of the ways I do that is I take multiple photos. I don't make myself beholden to just one photo. A lot of guys do. They like that, and that's fine. But I like to take multiple photos so that when I sit down and draw my piece, I can pick and choose, oh, this arm looks good, that arm looks good. And then I naturally find myself working stronger C curves into the pose than if I'm just trying to draw from one reference, then I start to just draw that reference. But that's one way that you can break through that. The other way to break through it is just your process alone. Don't start out using reference every time. Sometimes that's the best way to go. It really is. You're just like, that piece, that's everything I need right there. That doesn't happen very often. If it does happen to you every time, then I would reassess what you're doing.
It kind of seems like you're just looking for the right thing to recreate.
Exactly. Every once in a while it will, man. I've had a few pieces that'll just jump out and I'm like, that's crazy. That's so close to what I was thinking, and then you can pick and choose what you need from that.
But did you still copy that one?
No, I mean, I push the reference as far as I can every time. I mean, I'm not going to lie, there have been a couple times where I'm like, man, that dude's face is damn near perfect. And maybe I just go in and, I kind of push things more along the lines of sort of a caricature, right? So, some
of the proportions.
Yeah, just mess with the proportions, but the features kind of stay the same, just exaggerated. Because I'm just kind of like, well, that's pretty much what I wanted.
Dude, you're a troll.
Yeah. No, not so much with that, but, definitely more along the lines of like some girls' faces naturally fit more of an elven. They have really high pronounced cheekbones and stuff like that. There's not a whole lot for me to change there, or, some guys, you look at them and you're like, man, that dude, he just looks like a gnarly wizard. There's not a whole lot to change. I just want to make his head a little bit skinnier and maybe add some more wrinkles or something like that. But again, that's pretty rare. Most of the time,
but you move into trolls and fairies and things get more fantastical. There's just no way to have a reference for that, really.
Yeah, and a lot of times with my human figures, too. I'm not, I really like to shape the skull in a way that creates a unique silhouette that I think pushes the person. If I'm drawing a big barbarian guy, they're going to have this huge square head, probably get a little bit longer in the thirds as you go down because that looks a little more heroic. Versus if I'm drawing a bard, then I'm probably going to shrink the thirds as they go down because you tend to look a little bit weak and a little bit weird that way, and a little bit bigger cranial mass, whatever I need to do. So it's still pushing those proportions completely different than would be in real life. But again, I like my fantasy art to look fantastical.
So you said a minute ago that you talked about using multiple references. Like that's kind of a part of your process. You like to get multiple different references.
Yeah.
We did talk about it when we were talking about the BB King piece. You used 15, 20
Yeah.
pieces
Oh,
or something
yeah. So
like
many.
that.
I just literally any photo I could find of him playing live.
So do you mind just going over then, since I know you said that was a part of your process, using all the multiple references, but do you mind just going over what your process would be for creating a piece, and then where sort of reference fits into that? Do you start usually with reference, or do you start with your own drawing?
Yeah, like I said, sometimes I have a rough idea and I will actually just start to look for reference. And sometimes that is, to me, the best way to go, where I'm just like, I can visualize it enough in my head that I know what I need out of reference, and I'll dig it up and look for it. The majority of the time, it doesn't work like that. The majority of the time, I start out with thumbnails, kind of nail down where I think the best camera angle is, where the light source should come from. And they're really crude. I mean, they're just like blocky stick guys. And sometimes not even that. Sometimes a representation of a guy will just be a tall rectangle, Once I get that done, then I will either hire a model and take a lot of photos of a model, or, maybe look on Google, or maybe a combination of both. And a lot of times I can find what I need. I actually have these little figures that the body coon, I think they're called, and they're just really articulated figures. And a lot of times I can pose one of those and light it and photograph it, because my figures are clothed. So I don't need all the little tiny joints and stuff. And when I do, I know the anatomy well enough that I can put it in there. But nothing beats a real model. So if I'm drawing something that has a lot of anatomy showing, then I'll try to find a model for that piece, or use myself as the model. And then once I get all the reference that I need gathered, by this point in the drawing, I've already gone up to sort of a rough sketch stage.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll blow that up, transfer that to my sketchbook, and then lay out all my reference and slowly start to draw the piece.
Now, do you do anything like changing the lighting on the references, or making those adjustments?
So if I don't hire a model and I am just working off, references that I can find out of books and magazines, I still will get those. And then, a lot of time, I mean, it's going to be really hard to find, when you're using, 20 pieces of reference, it's going to be hard to find 20 pieces of reference that also help you construct the pose you're looking for, but also are lit the same way that you need. So that's part of that knowledge, is being able to look at those muscles, know the insertions, know what the shape of the muscle is underneath the skin, so that you know how to light it and where the core shadow would be and things like that. And usually a lot of times there's a certain leeway you can get to where maybe not all the information is there in your reference. Maybe you have 70%, but you know enough to bluff the rest in, and it's acceptable.
Is there like a minimum number of references you think you need for, if you need to make an accurate description of, say, a portrait? Is there a certain number of references that you'd like to have?
I mean, if I'm doing a piece, sometimes I need 3-4 references. If I have a good model, sometimes I can do it with, a handful of references and then some close-up shots of things like hands and features. If I'm doing, characters where there's multiple people in the scene, then things can get messy, because sometimes I'll just make the same model be multiple characters, because if I get a guy who's muscular, I can make him a skinny little dude. I can make him a big fat guy. It doesn't matter. And I'll just pose him. And then you just have to pay attention to your camera and your lens, because you can't actually move your camera around too much, right? Because then you're going to blow your scene. Yeah. So you have to treat it as though you were shooting the scene. So
they have to move over into the different positions.
Yeah. And you just mark your ground.
You almost compose it.
Yeah, totally. You just mark your ground and you shoot it like you would if you were shooting it the whole scene. I don't know, man. There's times where I've had a mountain of reference for a piece. If there's just a ton of stuff going on, multiple buildings, multiple people, different things going on with the atmosphere and background. And I mean, I'll have a mountain of reference. And there's times where I have 2 or 3 pieces.
So even when you have models, do you have times where you still can't really tell maybe what a certain muscle is or what that shape is? Are you able to use anatomy books to kind of fill in some of the blanks? Or?
You can. I mean, you have to know how to use it though, because you're not going to find that pose, right? So maybe you're like a little foggy on a muscle insertion on the back. Like back's probably one of my rougher areas that I know a lot of the rhythms and the main bulks, but maybe I want to pop something a little bit more. So, I'll bust open my Bridgman book and then I'll be like, oh yeah, that's right. That's where that goes. Or I'll pull out a drawing from Eric Geist because I bought a lot of his back demos because I love how he does it. So, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, that's where that goes. And then using the knowledge in that, I can put it in the pose that I need. But again, that goes back to make sure you understand understand anatomy, because you can't draw a lat in the wrong place and expect it to read well, or you can't do the trapezius insertion in the wrong place, or where the oblique or the thread. That stuff's got to make sense.
So let's go back to the process again.
Yeah. So thumbnails, rough sketch, reference, and then working from my rough sketch. I tend to transfer the rough sketch to my sketchbook because I didn't use in most cases, I didn't use the reference to get to the rough sketch stage. So it's going to have a lot more motion and fluid to it because I was just able to create, right? If you work a lot from reference, things tend to get tight and stiff and look posed. And
because they are.
Right.
You're
yeah.
What do you call it? Being
a slave to the reference.
Being a slave to the reference.
You're working for the reference. So, and there are ways to get around that. Like Rockwell would put stacks of books under the toes of his people so that when you pull the toes up on the foot, it looks like they're running. So little things like that will add more motion, but you have to be able to push it beyond that. I find that if I can take it as far as I can drawn wise, which is usually about like a comic book level, I can get crazy amount of movement and action and just a lot of fluid motion in my pieces, and then start injecting all the information from the pose. And if you've taken good reference, or you found good reference, or a combination of the two, you should just be able to take the information you need and plug it. It shouldn't be, I got to change the sketch because it's not the same pose as my reference. That defeats the purpose. Then you might as well just work from the reference. And so
then it's not you composing the piece.
It just depends on how good you are with your reference, because Rockwell stuck to the reference pretty closely. You can't, his creating and composition for the most part happened in the posing of his characters. And so it's no less creative than if he sat down and worked it out in the sketch phase. He put that much effort into composing what he needed from his reference to then be able to make his piece. And so you can, but a lot of guys don't do that. I've watched people take reference and they'll just kind of stand like this, snap, okay, we're done. And it's like, man, what did you get from that?
No thought.
Yeah, and play around, man. You've hired that model. You should. Oh, that's the other thing. Just a little side note. Always pay your model. Always. One thing I've always been told is that if you expect the model to do the things you want them to do, you have to pay them. You have to make it about work. You can't boss somebody around if you're not paying them. So if posing, a lot of people think, oh, this is easy. It's not. It's really not, especially when you're talking like, I'm going to make you get in uncomfortable poses for an hour. I had a model. He's amazing. His name's Yoni. I've had that dude bent backwards over a chair with a leg in the air, bracing himself on his pinky. Like crazy stuff, man. If you're not paying people to do that, don't expect them to do that.
Yeah, it seems weird if you're not going to pay them to do it.
Yeah, and so even like I shot a barmaid for a piece at the bar I used to go to, and she just had like, man, her just everything about her. I'm like, that's the character. That's pretty much how I want the character to look. And so I shot her for a piece, and she was going to do it for free because she's just a huge fantasy buff, and the brewery bought a couple of my paintings off me, and she loves them, blah 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 blah, and she just thought, oh, cool. And I still paid her $100, for half an hour's worth of taking photos because it's the right thing to do.
I'm gonna use your face.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, hopefully a lot of people see your mug.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's worth it.
It isn't going to look exactly like her, right? But she still posed for me. It was still awkward, and it's still like she did work. So you pay for the work.
Right.
Okay, that's the side note. So yeah,
So back to it. We're past the thumbnail now.
yeah, we're past the rough sketch. We've got our reference.
We're past the reference.
Yeah, and so if you haven't constructed your reference shots in a way that puts you pretty much where you visualized your painting being, then I think the only other route to really go is the way that I do it. And again, this is personal. Everybody's got their own things. But I think when you work everything out in a rough sketch form and you have those great movements in the body that are exaggerated and the model's never going to get into, and then you're just looking at the information, like, for instance, let's say a guy's jumping off a horse. You're not going to get a model in that pose, right? So, that's what happened last time when it froze. That's why I said it. Anyways. So you're not going to get a model in that pose, right? How am I going to get a model to look like they're jumping off a horse? So what I did with Yoni in that case was I had him lay down on a small bench. It's called a drawing horse. It's what we use in school. And so I lost all that information on his underside because he's laying down. But I know enough about anatomy that I could re-inject that. So I had the rough sketch. So I knew how I wanted his body to look. I couldn't get him in that pose. You cannot get into the pose that I was trying to do. So I just needed something that kind of put him at the right angle with the right perspective. And then that gave me the information I needed to inject into what I had already done to convince the viewer that it was realistic.
Just fill in the gaps.
That's how you make the reference work for you. You know, and his legs weren't in the right place. Well, I shot 20 pictures of his legs in different poses with different lighting to see what worked best. So I had all the information. None of his legs were in the right pose, but there was enough different views of his legs that I could see the anatomy. I could see the insertions. I could see the vascularity, all these little things that you don't really think about when you're making stuff up. I don't really think about vein networks, you know, but you can see those on him. So I can lay that over top of what I drew and up that level of realism. There was one where at the same pose or same painting, I used him as an ogre who was attacking the guy jumping off the horse. And I was pretty happy with the drawing, but I still took pictures of Yoni because there's certain things that you don't consider, like maybe how the skin folds around the lat when a guy's twisting his body and kind of leaning back. And then you see that, and you see the shadow, and you see the core shadow. So you take just that little bit, but when you put 7, 8, 9 different things like that into your drawing, it now looks real.
You've gone up a level.
Yeah, because you're not just working from invention. And, you know, 10 years down the road, maybe I remember that and I go, oh, I remember exactly how that wrinkle was. So now I don't need that information for my reference photo, but maybe there's something else. You know, maybe it's how the skin folds around the armpit or how it tucks underneath the pec muscle. These little things that really make stuff look real. That's what you should be using your reference for. You know, not just trying to do a one-to-one imitation
recreation of it. Yeah. Was Yoni he was the model at
Watts?
At Watts.
Yeah. He's been modeling there for a long time. He's great.
And those were the guys that where you finally were like, you had that aha moment, right? Where they were talking about where you learned about everybody using reference.
The first hint of it was with Neil Adams. So one day I'll have to tell the story of the most brutal critique I've ever had in my life from Neil Adams. But one thing I noticed was during the critique, he was drawing pretty much the whole time. And he was drawing on a light box. And at one point, part of his critique of me was to start learning to appreciate doing realistic art because it's kind of where I was naturally inclined to draw because I, a long time ago, wanted to draw in a different style. So while he was saying that, he goes like, look at this. And he showed me his actual reference photos underneath what he was drawing. Now, his drawings were, I mean, he's an amazing artist, in my opinion. The guy's been relevant for so long, and he's so good that I don't know how you don't give him the respect that he deserves. It was crazy to see like these really static posed images and how much he had pushed them. And that's when I realized, like, man, he told me, you know, he's been doing this forever, you know, and it's like, and then I kind of went back to my table and thought about it. And there was a lot of things I had to think about because, like I said, it was a 45-minute critique and it was pretty brutal, but fair. And that's why I had him critique me, because he's kind of known for that. He doesn't sugarcoat it like a lot of guys do because they're afraid they'll hurt your feelings. And so now you flash forward, I don't even know, 10 years, and I'm at Watts. And two guys that I've looked up to for a long time, Eric Gist and Lucas Graciano, teach there. And I've admired these guys for a very long time. They've both worked for Magic for a while. I've known Eric's work even longer than that because he'd done some stuff that I was familiar with before I knew about his Magic stuff and whatnot. Anyways, so that was kind of the thing. I'm like, I definitely want to go to this school because these guys are there teaching it. And man, I've watched these guys create so many paintings while I was there. And they used reference for everything. And most of the time now I can look at, like, Eric just did a bunch of cards for Marvel. And I'm like, oh, that one's Bridget. Oh, that one's Yoni. Oh, that one's Eric. You know, and it's crazy because Eric's not a big man. He's like 185 pounds, and he would use himself for a guy who's, you know, a 400-pound superhero. And that's the thing is, like, you see these guys and you're like, oh, I can tell that's, you know, so-and-so model in a pose, but you can see how much further than the pose they take it. And I think that's why a lot of people think that artists don't use reference, because the really good artists will push it so far beyond the reference that you don't think it's a reference anymore, because it doesn't look like a static posed person standing there and you just painted them in a costume.
Because they use the background to take the reference and push it well beyond what it was.
Yeah.
What it could be.
Yeah. So they have, you know, they have a very clear idea of where they want to go.
So how do you actually go about being able to rely less and less on reference materials then? Because that's what some people listening to this are going to want to know. How do I move from being someone who recreates a piece of reference to being able to, like you said, push beyond that and push beyond the reference?
Well, so you have to be willing to step out of your comfort zone, okay? Because when you're just painting the model, especially if you took the photo and it's a really good photo and it's lit right and whatnot, it's very easy once you've learned the academic side. And I'm not saying I'm great at it. I understand it intellectually, but I'm not great at it. But it's very easy once you learn the academic side to just recreate what you see to the ability you're capable of. That's comfortable, right? You know what you're doing. You understand the medium, whatever. You have to get out of that comfort zone, and you have to go, I want to use the information the model provided, but I want them in this pose, much more dynamic, much crazier, much more whatever. And I don't just mean like adding more detail or subtracting detail or adding more muscularity, whatever. I mean like really pushing the pose, really accentuating those C curves. And the way that I get to that is by starting with that rough sketch, because I'll push knowing that it's going to tighten up as I inject more and more information into it, because that just naturally happens.
Right.
I'll push the pose as far as I possibly can without breaking it, and then let it kind of meet somewhere in the middle between static and almost broken.
But the process of being able to do that, is that just that's just a putting in the hours thing? I mean,
yeah, you got to have the knowledge. You have to have the knowledge. If you can't do that, and it has nothing to do with you stepping out of your comfort zone, then you haven't put the mileage in to learn anatomy, learn how to turn form, learn how, you know, like, how could you, if you don't understand the insertion of a muscle, you know, its origin point, where it ends, and what the full shape of that muscle looks like, if you don't understand that, how are you ever going to put it in a different position in a convincing way? Yeah. You have to practice doing that specifically with every muscle until you can do it over and over again. And you have to be diligent about that. You have to sit there and practice with intent. Today, I'm going to study. Every Monday, I'm going to study backs for a month until I know how to take that muscle and twist it and turn it in space as easily as anybody else. And there are guys who do it better. Some guys just find turning shape in space to be easy, and some guys find it hard. I think if you're able to break it down to its most basic shape, it's as easy as it's going to get for you. If I can turn something into a cylinder or a sphere or, you know, a cube, which everything is made up of those, then you should be able to turn that in space. And if you can't even do that, then you need to go even further back and start setting up still lifes in your studio of a box with a ball next to it. Light.
Right.
I'm not joking. I mean,
Serious,
this
yeah.
was literally told to me when I started school. And I didn't consider myself a shitty artist when I started there. But one of the first things they told me was go home and start drawing boxes, start drawing balls. You're not turning your shapes in space. You're not understanding the forms. You're not understanding the planes. You're not understanding, atmospheric light and reflected light. And it just...
How much crying did you do that day?
Oh man, I always tell people, I gotta censor this, but I always tell people it's like getting, this is the censored version. It's like getting kicked in the nuts for 12 hours a day. I mean,
going to the atelier.
Yeah. Well, coming from, I knew I wasn't going to be, I tell people I'm not going to be the best guy there. I'll probably be one of the worst because I had no academic fundamental background at all, but I was not prepared for how soul crushing it was. It was really hard. But it made me a way better artist. And man, I wish I could have stayed there for another 6 years,
And didn't you say you also had like a secret sketchbook almost? Like,
yeah, that's the thing. So, you're going to have your sketchbook that you show everybody. My sketchbook that I carry around with me everywhere usually has my prelims for paintings because I'm constantly trying to work on getting work done. But I have secret sketchbooks that end up in the trash because they're terrible. Because I'm practicing stuff I suck at on purpose. So I don't want people to flip through that and see all the shit that I suck at. But if you can't draw from imagination, then get yourself a little sketchbook and every day spend a couple hours drawing from imagination. And I guarantee you within a couple months, if you have the knowledge to draw realistically from a model, then you've got all the information you need to draw from imagination. But just like anything else, until you've done it a bunch of times, you're not going to be good at it. And that's why a lot of guys give up and go back to just painting the model. Because they'll be really, really proficient at that. And then they try to do something from imagination. And they're like, Jesus, it looks like a high school kid's drawing. And that's not a bad thing, man.
Is it a matter of not being able to do it at all, or the time that it takes to?
No, I think you can't do it at all. It's just like anything else. It's just like me. I was doing decent artwork that I was getting hired and paid for when I went to Watts. But as soon as I had to draw academically from a model, which I had never done, with a clipboard on my legs and, under the duress of being in a class, drawing from, the Riley rhythms and the Loomis method and Bridgman and all this stuff that I never even heard of the Riley, under trying to figure out how to do linear lay-ins the way they do them and 2-value block-ins. My stuff looked terrible. There were people there, and, 'cause this is a small place, you hear people talk. There were people there that literally thought I stole my sketchbook and was trying to pass it off as mine because the stuff I was doing in school was so much worse than what was in my sketchbook.
That is so good.
And you can't expect the opposite to not happen. If you've never really drawn from imagination, you can't expect to sit down and draw from imagination and be great at it just because you're great at something else. You're working a different muscle.
So the secret sketchbooks that nobody ever saw, those are the ones that really made you better because you kept going until it just stopped sucking, basically.
I sort of shot myself in the foot because when I originally started drawing, pretty much everything was from imagination. And of course I was terrible at it. But by the time I quit drawing from imagination, I was pretty decent at it and doing passable comic book stuff. I mean, I was doing a lot of that. I did my own independent comic and all kinds of stuff. And what happened was I got into drawing realism and stopped using imagination. And so fast forward to where I started to do more imaginative stuff after, I don't know, 7, 8 years of not drawing from imagination at all, and or very little at least. And I was terrible again. And that was a huge blow to my ego, just like going to school and being terrible there. So, start to see your sketchbooks. And
so that whole, it's like riding a bike thing's kind of bullshit. You got to work yourself back into it.
No, it's like a lot of artists say, you have to keep your tools sharp. And if you don't use your tool, it's going to get dull. And that's what happened. My tools got dull. And just like anybody else, I had to go back and put the mileage in. And I'm still doing that. I still have secret sketchbooks right now because I feel personally that I'm not able to draw from imagination as easily as I could as a kid. I think a lot of that comes from bravado because confidence will go a long way, right? And I think as a kid, you're just full of confidence, man. It's oozing out of every part of your body. And I think that my drawings looked so confident that you kind of looked past some of the issues. Now I got a better eye and I understand anatomy better and I second guess myself a lot more. My confidence isn't as strong, especially working from imagination, especially when it's so easy to just rely back on your reference.
Sure.
So there's that whole learning curve that I have, again, added to the fact that I feel I'm not even drawing as good as I was when I was a teenager, so that makes it a lot harder. But that's all the more reason why, just get that sketchbook, man, and fill it up, and don't try to make it pretty. Right. Just do it. Just put the miles in.
Put in the time.
Yeah. Recall the information. There's a couple artists who teach a method where they'll tell you to draw something when you're looking at it, and then put the reference away, and then redraw it from imagination. And just, that's supposedly, I've never done it, but supposedly that's a really good exercise to get you there really quick. I feel that I have the knowledge to visualize things in my head well enough, and I have the academic background enough to at least do a comic book style version of that on paper from imagination with no reference.
Do you think a lot of that, though, comes from because you use a lot of custom reference that you shoot yourself? So do you think you're able to do that now from imagination because you shot so much of your own reference with your own lighting?
No, I think it came from life drawing.
Oh, it did? Okay.
Yeah, that's why I stress life drawing so much, man. So when you sit down and draw a picture, a lot of times, you're just drawing what you're looking at, and you're not really absorbing what you're looking at. When you draw from life, you're not just looking at something and trying to draw it. You really have to focus and, what is this? Why is that lit that way? Where is it attaching? Let me turn my head and see how that goes around the body. Oh, that's what that is. That shit sticks with you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of times where they'll have tattoos or the lighting will be a little iffy and it's sort of ambiguous on the model, or maybe they moved a little bit, and you turn and kind of lean over, and kind of by the guy next to you, and you're like, oh, and
that's what that is.
And man, those things stick with you. And so I'll sit down and be like, why am I stuck on this? I know the anatomy of a leg. Why does this look wonky to me? And something from class will pop into my head. I'll be like, oh yeah, that's like when so-and-so was in this pose. So I think life drawing is invaluable for building up that mental library, for sure.
And are you ever able to do a custom reference that helps to remind you of those things at all? You know what I mean? Like when you're talking about a certain way of fold looks of skin or something like that, you saw that in class. Are you ever able to recreate that in an image? Or is there just no way to recreate
I
that?
can't, but I will go, oh, I remember when so-and-so was in a pose like this, and the way that the, skin underneath the lat, or maybe on the last rib, folded by how she twisted this way. And it won't be any of my reference or anything like that. So what I can do is know that it should be there. And sometimes you can bluff it in depending on how shadow and light is. And if not, then I at least know exactly what kind of reference I need. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, okay, I want to have that there. And I can't make it look right. I've tried 15 times. So maybe I try to get into that pose if I can, or I have Ashley get into that pose.
So that's one of the advantages to shooting your own reference and kind of getting good at it, is that when you do have one of those gaps, you can go back again and do it again. You can shoot it a different way. Yeah,
and there's a lot of things you learn. We had he's a student. He's a great student at our school, Roberto, and he also models there as well. And he's got these like crazy joints. And anything he did with his hands was amazing. One day I spent like 45 minutes. I just paid him to let me take 1 billion pictures of his hands.
You mean the way he articulates?
Yeah.
His hands?
He had like his like all the anatomy was very visible. He was super in shape, really lean. He was the exact opposite of me, basically. And he had like his knuckles were like, if like it's kind of like Zoolander with the hand model, right? Like David Duchovny, like that guy they were like the ideal hands. All the wrinkles looked super cool. They weren't like random and weird, and his knuckles were shaped perfect. And he just knew how to pose his hands. And just from watching him on stage, I maybe drew him 8 times the whole time I was there, because he didn't model much. When I say 8 times, I mean like 8 classes, because you're drawing the model over and over again during the classes, right? sometimes it's quick drawing and you might draw him, 50 times in a class or something. But anyways.
So you took pictures of his hands for like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And now nobody else has it, right? You're
Right.
the only one. I mean, that's
well,
part of
and everybody else at Watts.
Well, I mean, but nobody's ever really going to get that lighting the way he was that day. Hydration, the light coloring.
And the thing is that just from watching him model on stage, and because he was so good at how he knew how to, no matter what pose he was in, his hands were always, and he posed really, really well, but his hands were always one of the most interesting parts. Just from seeing that and being like, oh, if you put the fingers that way, now when I do need to shoot my reference, I know, man, this looks really dynamic. It isn't
the most
so much
interesting hands in the world.
Yeah, it isn't so much trial and error and hope to get something that looks cool. I can be like, no. I remember when Roberto put his pinky like this, and these two fingers touched like that, and I can be like, boom, I know it, and put the hand in that position.
And then you can put in different stuff too, right? Like backdrops and other kind of lighting changes and reshoots.
Yeah,
and
stuff. Obviously because you understand the anatomy, right? So you can look at the fingers as sort of like cylinder, ball, cylinder, ball, or you can do, like for old hands especially, I like to do more like a 4x4 shape, like a elongated cube, and then a real gnarly like wonky sphere, and then because I find that on older people, when you really change the planes that sharply, instead of it being round and just bam bam, it looks older, because a lot more lines. They say the lines add 10 years, right? And so you can take somebody's hands like him and make them look like an old person's hands, or make them look younger, or make them even look feminine if that's what you wanted to do, if you understand the anatomy. And that all goes back to what I was saying before, where if you can't push the reference to where you want it to be, then you probably need to go and learn anatomy more.
Okay, so all of this about reference, it sounds great. And making all this custom reference and shooting everything and lighting it and getting it exactly the way you want. But, I mean, come on. Why don't we just use Google or whatever images you can just pull up on a search engine?
Well, I think the most obvious reason is because if you can pull it up, so can everybody else. That's the first reason, I would say. Because why would you, and it's funny because I actually did a piece, it was my very first oil painting, and then realized that Lucas used it on something that he did years ago.
Said the same reference.
Yeah, and that's the reason why. A far superior artist used that reference,
Yeah, you came up with a joke and then you found out George Carlin did it in the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, that's the first reason. Most of the artists I know are lazy. So they're going to type in whatever it is they're looking for and take the first cool image on the first page of Google. They're not even digging deep. And at that point, then you got to figure how many other people have done that are better than you and before you, That's reason number one. Reason number two is you're going to compromise your idea every time. I mean, how rare must it be that the exact idea you have in your head is going to pop up on Google in the pose you want, at the camera angle you want, with the perspective you want, with the lighting you want, with the anatomy you want? It's not going to happen, man.
So immediately you're compromising your art just to get something that you can do quicker.
Yep. And now you're working for your reference, which is going to equal not as good of a photo or not as good of a painting. And
so technically it limits you, because now you're limited just to that image.
So if you need to work from reference that much, or you choose to work from reference that much, shoot your own.
And then you just don't have, of course, I'm always the business guy, right? So now what I'm thinking is, well, now we don't have copyright issues,
exactly,
or other things like that.
I mean, we've all heard stories where so-and-so grabbed an image he thought was copyright free on the internet, painted a painting of it, and then got into a huge litigation battle because it became a thing. And you can't do that, man. Why take that risk? And if you look at the price of going and buying like that stock photography to get the license for it, it's ridiculous. I mean, because they're usually selling to corporations. So do you want to spend that kind of money, or would you just rather spend $100? Like what I like to do is I'll usually draw, say if I'm doing the cards, I'll usually plan out my next 5 to 10 cards. Then I'll look at the cards and get my biggest bang for the buck. If I'm going to pay a model $100 an hour, then what I'm going to do is try to figure out, like, let's use Yoni, for example, again. When Yoni came over to
shout out to Yoni again.
Yeah, right.
Get a lot of play, Yoni.
Bakersfield model on Instagram. When I used Yoni, he was 4 cards for me. I had paid him for, I think, 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I'm not just going to photograph this guy and then, buy. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, well, I showed him the sketch. And that's the great thing about doing the rough sketch too, is when I'm trying to convey to you my idea, that's frustrating. When I can open up my sketchbook and say, this is the pose I need you to get into, or something close enough to it that I can use the information I need from you, and there was things I had to do where it was like I could only photograph him from the belly button up to get part of the information. And then I had to photograph his torso separate, and then I had to photograph his legs separate, because the pose I put the creature in is physically impossible without dislocating, but it looked cool. And like I said before, I'm always going to side with cool over correct. Yeah. But I can't get the model in that pose. So I have to basically break it down into sections.
So are there really any places where you can find reference that not a lot of artists are using?
No. If you can search for it, so can everybody else. It's that easy. It's that easy. Now,
maybe books?
Yeah. I mean, you can buy some older books. You can go through old periodicals, things like that if you want to. But again, I think just finding a model and hiring them is easier. And it doesn't have to be a real model. I've asked people from local gyms. I've asked people just walking down the street, just ask. If you're a genuine artist, give them your business card. Maybe you got a sketchbook on you. Show them your sketches. Tell them, go to my website, check out my work. If you feel comfortable coming over, you can bring friends, whatever you want to do. Come to my studio. I'm going to shoot you. There's no nudity. There's nothing weird.
Right.
I might have you get into a costume, whatever. Right. And if you don't, fine. And then I'll just find another model.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
Oh wait, nothing's weird. It's on the up and up. I mean, how many times people have to deal with just complete weirdos?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why you have to be professional about it. And that's why that's another reason why you always pay. The other thing is
fair wage for fair time.
Yeah. And the other thing is CYA. Sure. Always cover your ass. If you pay them, they've done a job. They can't ever come back on you for it, Right. And if you feel like there might be something on your end that could be misconstrued, maybe there is some nudity involved or something, then you have a witness there as well.
And it's helpful with you, like you have Ash, right? I mean, she helps make everyone comfortable. She's pretty. Yes. She's tattooed. Yeah. She's disarming.
Yeah.
I'm
a big 300-pound tattooed hairy guy. And I'm telling you to come out in the middle of nowhere and let me photograph you.
I get it. It's weird.
Yeah. So, if it's a female, usually, saying, oh, yeah, my wife's going to be there. You can bring as many people as you want, whatever.
Right.
And, who fucking
Here's where we'll be, at what time. Please feel free to let anybody know.
Who knows? Maybe they bring a friend, and I'm like, oh, hey, you want to be in this too?
Right.
And then now I've made my job easier.
You catch them at a certain angle and go, oh no, you're the one.
Yeah.
I'll still pay you, dude. But you're the one. I'm taking a picture of you.
And you just got to know that if you found the reference, everybody else can too. Now, sometimes the reference is too good and you're like, I'm willing to take that risk because this is awesome. This is exactly what I was hoping for. And that's happened to me a couple times. I won't do that on client work, but I will do it on personal work.
I've also seen some one-upsmanship in art too, where you can tell certain artists are going, no, I'm going to take a run at this one. I know I saw so-and-so did it, but watch this.
What I like to do as a little bit of a side thing is sometimes I'll find an artist and I can just get a gut feeling. I'm like, that dude worked from reference. And then I'll fucking search out that reference.
I remember a few pieces that we will not talk about right now, but maybe later on, another time.
There's an artist, I'm going to slaughter his name. I swear I'll say it right one day. It's Pitar Mendelthuzela or something like that. And he did a piece, and I don't know why. I'm just like, dude, I think I've seen that. And it was like from the 15th century. It was a photograph. It was like a photograph or what, like an old, crazy black and white photograph of this, some saint something or other. And it sure enough, man, that was his reference, and like, I don't know. I like that, because it's one of those things where you're like, man, I really look up to that dude's work. He's awesome. I wish I had the brush control that he has. Yeah. And then you see that he's working from reference and you're like, oh, thank God.
The reference hunter.
Yeah. So I think I do it more to just bolster my own confidence than anything else. But yeah, I think that's I think that's the thing, man. If you need reference that much, then work from your own. Now, again, back to the Google thing. If you are going to use Google, and I'm not saying I don't, I do a lot because I'm cheap and I don't want to hire models unless I have to, then use a bunch. I'll be like, oh, I kind of like this hand, and I kind of like this arm, and I kind of like this guy's torso, or this girl's waist, or, this person's hair. I try to never work one-to-one because, one, that's the easiest way to get busted for using reference. And I'm not saying I don't ever do it, but like I said, I won't do it for client work, only for personal stuff. But I try never to work one-to-one, and if I do, it's pretty crazy. Like usually it'll be like a homeless guy, and then I draw it, and it's some anthropomorphized creature that it doesn't look like. I'm not trying to make it look like that guy. Right. But anyways, if you're going to use Google, try to use as much reference as you can. Learn the anatomy, learn how to manipulate light so that you can create a cohesive idea and something that doesn't look collaged together. And again, do your rough sketches, do your thumbnails, and take the information you need from multiple references and make that one image. Because then it's hard to trace it back. In school they used to tell us, don't be afraid to steal the buttons, just don't take the whole shirt. Which means don't be afraid to take a little bit of information from this image, but don't take the whole fucking image. And that way you can create something that is original from Googled reference, that nobody else is going to take those same 15 images, pick the same 15 things out of those 15 images that you decided you needed for your image. So even if they work off the same reference, the odds of them using the same information you did are pretty slim.
Well, and beyond that, I know you go into shop and reposition, relight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't really worry about the lighting, but there's a lot of times where, I'll take it in the Photoshop and like maybe I'll try to slap something together really quick and be like, oh, if I do like this arm, does it even look right to this body? And it's easier
compositionally.
Yeah, rather than trying to sketch it out really quick, which might take me 15-20 minutes. I can go into Photoshop, just cut the arm off, stick it next to the body, even if the sizes and stuff aren't right, whatever. I can just be like, okay, that looks relatively right.
That's about what I was going for.
And then I'll just go back to my source reference and again take the image I need and plug it into what I drew. I did try. I've seen guys do this, and years ago I tried sort of collaging it together in Photoshop and then printing it out and using that as my reference. Where you kind of piece everything together and try to make it look like an image. And there are guys who are good at that because it's really just a form of photo bashing. I am not good at that, and I find it way faster and way more productive to just print out my references, lay them on my, tape them to my drawing table around my sketchbook, and then just draw and look up at the reference I need at that time and take the information. It's quicker for me. If it's quicker for you to kind of photo bash one together, print it out, and that's your reference, then do it. Whatever process you need to achieve the best result is the right process.
So just because I always feel the need to summarize, it kind of sounds like your general philosophy is reference is a necessity. So everyone just needs to kind of get a little bit more honest about what they're doing.
Yeah.
And instead of treating your reference like a dirty little secret that we don't talk about, that maybe people, should be focused more on reference and creating their own references. Rather than pretending they're not using reference, start creating your own and making it a part of your actual artistic process, that the reference part, the creation of and forming your reference is part of your overall process, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah. And I think if you can push your reference so far that people don't think it's reference anymore, then you're doing it right.
Yeah.
If you've taken reference photos and you've pushed that image to something so different than what your photo was that people can't even believe that came from a photo, then you're doing it right. The reason I think people should be more open about their reference material is because you're going to end up with a kid like me who thinks he's doing it all wrong because he can't draw strictly from imagination, and it could set him back for years. Where if you came out and taught somebody how to properly use reference instead of trying to hide behind ego and say you don't use reference, or create some kind of mythos around you that I don't need reference. And if you don't, amazing. But if you do and you're saying you don't, then you're doing a disservice to that kid who could probably learn how to use reference properly if you just were honest, than if you lied and said, no, you're doing it. Yeah, I don't need reference. I don't know why you do.
So hear it here first, right? Cecil Porter definitely uses reference.
Yes.
join us next week as we continue our discussion about absolutely nothing important whatsoever. If you have questions you would like Cecil to cover in the podcast, use email cecil@cecilporterstudios.com and include the phrase podcast question in your email subject. Also, this podcast is currently unsponsored. If you would like to sponsor an art podcast that isn't about art, but isn't really about other things either, email Cecil@cecilporterstudios.com. Rate, subscribe, and review, and we'll see you next time, you animals.